What if I told you the most terrifying Sith Lord never appeared in any of the Star Wars films? A being so consumed by the dark side that even Emperor Palpatine feared their power. While everyone obsesses over Darth Vader and Maul, there exists a Sith so dangerous, the Jedi Council attempted to erase all records of their existence. Today, we're diving into the forgotten history of Darth Tenebrous, the Sith who mastered both the Force and science in ways that nearly broke reality itself. Born as Ruges Gnome on the planet Bith, Tenebrous possessed something rare, a mind that could comprehend both the mystical nature of the Force and the cold precision of mathematics. Unlike most Sith, who relied purely on passion and hatred, Tenebrous approached the dark side like a scientist dissecting a specimen. The Bith are known for their intellectual capabilities, with brains that can process information at speeds that would make supercomputers jealous. Now, imagine that level of processing power turned toward mastering the dark side. Tenebrous was born during a time of relative peace in the galaxy. The Sith were believed extinct, operating in secret under Darth Bane's rule of two. While most citizens of the Republic lived in ignorance of the dark side's continued existence, the young Bith was already sensing patterns in the Force that others couldn't perceive. His Force sensitivity manifested differently than most. Where others felt emotional connections to the Force, Tenebrous perceived it as complex equations and probability matrices. As a child, he could predict events with uncanny accuracy by simply analyzing the mathematical certainties of cause and effect. What made Tenebrous truly dangerous wasn't just his Force abilities, it was his expertise in the science of manipulation. Under the public identity of a renowned starship designer named Ruges Gnome, he infiltrated the highest levels of Republic society nearly a century before Palpatine would attempt the same feat. His designs revolutionized hyperspace travel, making him not just wealthy, but influential among the galaxy's elite. Few suspected that the brilliant reserved Bith harbored any connection to the Force, let alone that he was secretly training in dark side traditions that predated even the rule of two. Unlike other Sith masters, who often found their apprentices through chance encounters, Tenebrous methodically searched for the perfect candidate. He spent decades analyzing genetic data from thousands of species, looking for specific markers that indicated both strong Force potential and particular personality traits. The Moon species caught his interest not just for their financial acumen, but for their naturally long lifespan, essential for the multi-generational plans he was forming. After narrowing his search to several candidates, he focused on a young Moon named Higo Damask, who would later become Darth Plagueis. What's fascinating is how Tenebrous engineered their first meeting. Rather than approaching Damask directly, he manipulated a series of business ventures with the young Moon's family, creating situations where Damask's latent Force abilities would be subtly tested. Over 3 years, he placed Damask in increasingly challenging scenarios, all while observing from a distance. When Tenebrous finally revealed himself to Damask, it wasn't a dramatic confrontation, but rather a calculated business meeting where he demonstrated just enough of his power to intrigue the ambitious Moon. He offered Damask knowledge beyond wealth. He offered him understanding of the fundamental forces that shaped reality itself. The apprenticeship began not with lightsaber training or Force lightning, but with mathematical equations and scientific theory. Tenebrous first taught Plagueis to understand the Force as a quantifiable energy field that could be measured, predicted, and ultimately manipulated through precise calculation. This approach differed dramatically from the emotional, passion-driven teachings of most Sith, setting the stage for a unique master-apprentice relationship that would ultimately reshape the dark side's approach to power. Tenebrous developed abilities that most Sith Lords would consider impossible. He could predict the future with mathematical precision through what he called intuitive calculus, combining Force visions with actual scientific formulas. This wasn't simple Force premonition. Where Jedi and Sith might get glimpses of possible futures, Tenebrous could calculate probability curves for various outcomes with precise percentages. But his most terrifying power was something he called midi-chlorian manipulation. While Plagueis would later attempt to create life, Tenebrous could actually alter the very particles that connected living beings to the Force. He could, in theory, sever someone's connection to the Force entirely, or enhance it beyond normal limits. He demonstrated this ability on remote worlds, experimenting on indigenous species by temporarily boosting their Force sensitivity, then observing how they adapted, or failed to adapt, to their new awareness. Many went mad from the sudden influx of sensory information. Others developed spontaneous but unstable Force abilities that inevitably led to their self-destruction. His lightsaber combat style was equally unorthodox. Rather than relying on established forms, he developed a technique based on probability and angles. He could calculate the exact position needed to counter any attack before his opponent even committed to it. Witnesses described his movements as unnaturally precise, with no wasted energy or flourish. During a confrontation with 3 Jedi Masters on Bolton, Tenebrous defeated all 3 without even drawing his lightsaber. He simply calculated the structural weaknesses of the building they were in and collapsed it precisely, burying them while he escaped unharmed. The incident was officially recorded as an architectural failure with no suspicion of Sith involvement. Perhaps most disturbing was his mastery of what he termed thought imprinting, a refined version of Sith mind influence that left no trace of manipulation. Rather than forcing thoughts into a victim's mind, he implanted mathematical patterns that would lead the victim's own thought processes to the conclusion Tenebrous desired. The victims believed the ideas were entirely their own, making the technique virtually undetectable. What truly sets Tenebrous apart from other Sith was his grand plan. While Bane created the Rule of Two and Sidious orchestrated the fall of the Republic, Tenebrous was playing a much longer game. He believed the Force itself was flawed. Through his research, he concluded that the dark side and light side weren't truly opposing forces, but rather 2 aspects of a cosmic equation that could be rewritten. He spent decades developing what he called the Bogan Codex, a series of calculations and rituals that would theoretically allow him to redefine the fundamental nature of the Force itself. The Codex wasn't a single document, but a complex web of information distributed across multiple formats. Parts were written in ancient Sith languages, parts were encoded in mathematical formulas, and still others were embedded in the actual molecular structure of artifacts he created. This ensured that no single person, not even his apprentice, could access the complete work without his guidance. Central to the Codex was the theory that the Force wasn't actually a mystical energy, but a fundamental physical law of the universe that could be manipulated through sufficient understanding. Tenebrous believed the traditional Sith and Jedi approaches were both fundamentally flawed. His calculations suggested that at certain points in space-time, the barriers between different aspects of the Force thinned, creating what he called convergence points. At these locations, under specific conditions, the basic rules governing the Force could be temporarily altered. With enough power and precision, these temporary alterations could be made permanent. Tenebrous identified 7 such convergence points scattered throughout the galaxy. He spent decades acquiring the land around these locations through dummy corporations, building research facilities disguised as mining operations or private estates. Each facility contained a piece of the elaborate mechanism he was constructing to enact his transformation of the Force. His goal wasn't to rule the galaxy, but to become the architect of a new reality. In his vision, the Force would no longer be divided into light and dark, but would exist as a unified field that responded directly to mathematical formulation, rather than emotion or spiritual connection. Those who understood his equations, with Tenebrous at the apex, would have unprecedented control over this new reality. His apprentice, Darth Plagueis, was merely one component in this grand design. Tenebrous selected Plagueis specifically for his potential to manipulate midichlorians, intending to use him as a living conduit for the transformation he planned. What Plagueis never knew was that Tenebrous had been subtly altering his apprentice's own midichlorians throughout his training. Using techniques too complex for even Plagueis to detect, Tenebrous gradually transformed his apprentice into what he called a Force confluent, a being whose very cells could serve as conduits between different aspects of the Force. The most disturbing experiment came when Tenebrous secretly introduced modified midichlorians into Plagueis's bloodstream during what was presented as an advanced meditation technique. These engineered organisms were designed to gradually rewrite Plagueis's connection to the Force, making him receptive to specific frequencies that would be crucial during the final ritual. Tenebrous conducted a trial run of his process on a remote moon in the Tingle Arm, an exterior arm of the galaxy's outer rim territories. The experiment resulted in a localized disruption of Force energies that created what later Jedi records would call a Force wound, an area where Force sensitives experienced disorientation and altered perceptions. The Jedi Council dispatched investigators, but Tenebrous had calculated their arrival time precisely and left no evidence of his involvement. As his plans progressed, Tenebrous began experiencing unexpected visions, mathematical anomalies in his predictions that he couldn't account for. These centered around a distant event involving a convergence of Force energy unlike anything he had calculated. We now know he was glimpsing fragments of what would later be known as the Skywalker lineage and their impact on the Force. These visions disturbed him, representing variables he couldn't control. In response, he accelerated his plans, taking greater risks and making his experiments more aggressive. This increasing urgency didn't go unnoticed by Plagueis, who began to suspect that his master was keeping crucial information from him. So, why don't we hear about this incredibly powerful Sith? The answer lies in how thoroughly his legacy was erased, not by the Jedi, but by his own apprentice. Darth Plagueis discovered his master's true intentions by piecing together fragments of information from various research sites. He realized Tenebrous planned to essentially consume him in the final ritual, using Plagueis's body as a vessel for a transformed consciousness that would be neither fully Tenebrous nor fully governed by the traditional rules of the Force. When Plagueis finally killed his master in the mines of Bal Demnik, he systematically destroyed all of Tenebrous's research and records. He spent years hunting down each facility, eliminating Tenebrous's associates, and erasing every trace of the Bogan Codex he could find. This wasn't just the typical Sith apprentice eliminating his master. It was a deliberate attempt to prevent Tenebrous's work from ever being completed. What Plagueis didn't know was that Tenebrous had anticipated this betrayal. He had infected Plagueis with specialized midichlorians of his own creation, microscopic portions of his consciousness that would slowly influence his apprentice's research into creating life. These engineered organisms operated subtly, nudging Plagueis's own brilliant mind towards certain questions and conclusions. They were designed not to control him directly, but to ensure that specific aspects of Tenebrous's research would continue even after his physical death. The irony is that Plagueis's own experiments, which eventually attracted Sidious as an apprentice, were unknowingly building upon Tenebrous's work. Even Sidious's obsession with cheating death can be traced back to fragments of Tenebrous's research that survived through Plagueis. Several of the Emperor's most secret projects, including research facilities on Jakku and experiments conducted in the unknown regions, bear striking similarities to Tenebrous's original work, despite Sidious having no direct knowledge of his predecessor's master plan. In a way, Tenebrous's influence extends through the entire Skywalker saga, like a shadow behind the main events we've all witnessed. The disturbances in the Force that facilitated Anakin's birth, the Emperor's contingency plans, and even the First Order's interest in uncharted space all connect to ripples created by Tenebrous's manipulation of the Force's fundamental nature. Perhaps most chilling is the possibility that certain aspects of Tenebrous survive within the Force itself. His experiments at the convergence points created persistent anomalies, places where the rules governing the Force operate differently. Some scholars believe these anomalies have been slowly expanding over the decades, subtly altering how the Force manifests throughout the galaxy. The most chilling aspect of Darth Tenebrous isn't just how powerful he was, but the possibility that he succeeded in ways we haven't yet realized. His experiments with the fundamental nature of the Force created ripples that continue to this day. Some scholars believe the mysterious Force awakening felt across the galaxy decades after the fall of the Empire wasn't natural at all. But the delayed activation of Tenebrous's final equation, set in motion centuries earlier. Consider this: every major shift in the Force's balance, from Anakin's conception to Rey's sudden emergence, has followed mathematical patterns that align perfectly with Tenebrous's convergence theory. These aren't coincidences, but the culmination of calculations made by a Sith Lord who saw the Force not as a mystical energy, but as a universal equation waiting to be solved. If that's true, then everything we think we know about the balance of the Force may be built on a foundation that's already been altered. And somewhere in the unknown regions, calculations set in motion by a Sith Lord long forgotten may still be working toward their conclusion. The real question isn't who was the most powerful Sith, it's whether the most powerful Sith is truly gone at all. Or if Darth Tenebrous, through his mathematical mastery of the Force, achieved a form of immortality far more subtle and far more complete than anything Palpatine ever dreamed possible. What if the Force, as we now understand it, is already Tenebrous's creation? And what happens when the final variable in his equation finally falls into place? These mathematical manipulations of the Force might just be scratching the surface of something far more profound. The true nature of the dark side itself may be entirely different from what both Jedi and Sith have believed for millennia. In our next exploration, we'll uncover the untold truth behind the dark side, where we'll reveal how everything you thought you knew about the Force might be built on a foundation of ancient misconceptions and deliberate deceptions. If you've enjoyed this journey through an alternate Star Wars timeline, there are more untold stories waiting to be discovered. Join our growing community of Star Wars enthusiasts who believe in exploring these what-if moments that could have changed the galaxy far, far away. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and activate notifications to catch our next alternative Star Wars story. Each tale offers a new perspective on the characters we love and the choices that define them. Remember to share your thoughts in the comments below. What other pivotal moments in the Star Wars saga would you like to see explored differently? Your ideas might inspire our next adventure. May the Force be with you, always.